Well, good evening. Welcome to our conference on the hidden wounds of war. My name is Gleaves Whitney, and as director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies, it is my honor to serve as your host this evening. This conference would not be possible without a number of wonderful partners: the Michigan Combat PTSD Task Force, the Soul Repair Center at Texas Christian University, Colonel Herm Kaiser, and numerous others. I also want to recognize a good friend, a dear friend, Jim Dunn, who's Deputy Director of the Michigan Veterans Affairs Agency here in Michigan. Jim, thank you for being here this evening. And I hasten to add the generous gift of Colonel Ralph Hauenstein, Grand Rapids' greatest World War II veteran in my book. Ralph just celebrated his 102nd birthday a week ago Thursday. Well, I'm uncharacteristically reading my remarks very tightly, and I think you'll understand why once I get into them. I'm the son of a veteran who fought in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Dad was a waist gunner on a B-24. He and his generation came back from the war and did much to build our country during the day. But then came the night. Sometimes at night, it seemed that these men could not escape the war. Dad never talked much about his personal Iliad, but in our house, we knew he suffered from something that he had experienced in 1943, 1944, and we just didn't know what to call it. Often he drank too much. Sometimes we kids would be awakened by the scream of his recurring nightmare. Occasionally he would go on a TV jag and watch a lot of westerns, and I guess looking back, there was something about Bonanza and Gunsmoke and some of these other shows that helped Dad process the war, because in every episode it was clear who the good guys were, it was clear who the bad guys were. And, you know, sometimes the men in the white hats had to kill the villains in the black hats, but only reluctantly and out of moral necessity. Once, only once, in our house, there was an allusion to the friends Dad had lost. The 10 men on the B-24 crew that lived in the tent next to Dad's in the New Guinea jungle. That neighboring crew had adopted a parrot. They trained that parrot to call out the name of each of the 10 crew members. So Bobby, Jimmy, Tommy, Johnny. One day the crew was shot down, did not make it back. And then came the night. That night, the parrot called each man's name. The captain in Dad's tent took out his pistol, went over to the empty tent, and shot the parrot. Now, when my generation was young, we did not know what to call the hidden wounds of war. We did not really understand the terrible odyssey that returning veterans experienced. But thankfully, that's all beginning to change, and in profound ways. Right here in Grand Rapids, there is wonderful work being done on behalf of our veterans. It's by my good friend, Dr. Michael Ryan, also by Carolyn Carino, Colonel Kaiser, many other dedicated professionals here in this room. We're really fortunate to have you gathered in one place. Now, their efforts give us hope that our culture is finally shining a light onto America's collective blind spot, as Dr. Shay puts it. The Hauenstein Center was proud to host our first PTSD conference on June 17, 2008, with the help of Michael, Carolyn, and many others. And this conference I look at as a sort of sequel to that conference, but in many ways it's really more of a prequel, because it grapples with the underlying moral injury of war, the kind of injury that casts a long shadow over the lives of our veterans, their families, their workplace, and over the broader culture. There are few better men to address the moral injury of war than the chaplain and colonel who really helped kickstart this conference, and I'm so grateful to his work. Herm Kaiser, and he will introduce tonight's keynote speaker. Herm, please come up and join me.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you all for coming. It's my honor to introduce Jonathan Shay, and they have a lot of words about him on the pamphlet, and so I'm not going to repeat any of those. We share one thing in common, and we both have an AB degree from Columbia, and if you don't know what an AB degree is, it's all but dissertation. And so that's one of the more famous degrees. But Jonathan went on and got a PhD and also an MD. So I've known Jonathan for several years now, and we met during some of the times when I was a chaplain, and we really wanted to know more about moral injury and learn more about some of the research that Jonathan had done that many of you know is written in his book, Achilles in Vietnam. I had to buy a new one tonight so that Jonathan could sign it because I've given 16 copies away already, and somehow they don't get back, and I guess that's a great sign. Jonathan and I this morning went to Calvin College, and there's a room right off the library that has a bunch of old professors, and it's called the Emeritorium. And Jonathan and I went and we visited with the retired professors for about an hour over a cup of coffee. And several of them were classicists. And it was just fascinating to be the fly on the wall and watch these men talk about what they knew about the classics and what they knew about Achilles and sharing stories with one another. I'd also like to introduce tonight my partner, who is co-founder and director of the Soul Repair Center in Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas, Rita Brock. Rita has also written a book, and she will be signing autographs tomorrow after we have our presentation together. Jonathan, it's a delight for me to welcome you to Grand Rapids, and it's a delight to have you here and present you to these people who have endured a wild winter. And so we hope that your warmth will warm us up tonight.
Thank you, Herm. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is not the first time I've spoken in this space, and I'm very, very happy to be back here. I am going to talk to you about, as you know, what war does to the mind and spirit. Most non-people who aren't immersed in this all the time, most of the public, most of the press, most of the Congress use the umbrella term PTSD for everything bad that happens as a result of going to war. Now, if that didn't create mischief, I wouldn't have any great problem with it. But it does create mischief in two ways. One is that, and I won't linger on this, that the word disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, is stigmatizing in that world of military forces. It's entirely honorable to be injured in the service of your country. But to fall ill, it's not dishonorable, but it sure is unlucky. And in that world, that's stigmatizing. Nobody wants to share a fighting hole with an unlucky soldier or Marine, or share an aircraft with an unlucky airman, or a watch with an unlucky sailor. It's stigmatizing. And here in Michigan is a wonderful psychiatrist named Frank Ochberg, that some of you I know, who and I and he and many others, including Pete Corelli, the recent Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, and General and now Senator Dallaire from Canadian Forces, went last year to the American Psychiatric Association to plead with them to just change the damn name, because some people would be less stigmatized and more amenable to asking for effective help if they didn't have that word disorder there. You're sick. This is from the range of sick, disease, illness, malady, whereas you want a word from blow, wound, injury, that semantic range. So now there are various problems with the official definition of post-traumatic stress disorder, but the most awful problem with it is that it's way too narrow for what really goes wrong and what really wrecks the lives of people who have been in war. And I will tell you, I'm not going to march you through the diagnostic manual on PTSD. I expect, as I look around the room, I expect there isn't a soul here who has not encountered most of it somewhere. And I'm here to tell you that it's not bad for a very, very, very narrow set of phenomena, which if those are the only thing affecting a veteran, rarely wrecks their lives. It can lead to focal disabilities. Those of you in the audience who are infantry veterans know very well what I mean by the word bunching up. What that is the well-founded knowledge that if you are in a close infantry fight, that if there are a number of American soldiers who get together and start talking about something or sharing cigarettes or playing poker or something, they become a quote-unquote lucrative target for a sniper or a mortarman. And so infantry veterans are just lifelong allergic to showing up in the open in a crowd. And that leads to certain focal disabilities. And there are some fascinating stories about the adaptations that infantry veterans use to get around it, like watching their son's little league game, not from the stands with the other parents, but sitting in their truck way out on the third baseline. So they talk about the game afterwards, they see the game, son knows he cares, etc., but they'll tell you, I can't sit in the stands. So what I want to do is to remind you of another fact, that this weird sort of Chinese restaurant menu, 2 from column A, 3 from column B in the diagnostic system, that these columns represent 3 sets of absolutely understandable and even biologically deeply rooted adaptations to the real situation. And this is real. This isn't imagined. It's real. Other human beings are trying to kill you and doing a damn good job of it because you see the results. So these 3 collections, without marching you through them, are really quite understandable. And I want to point out to you that the so-called intrusive cluster, that includes repetitive nightmares, intrusive thoughts, intrusive memories, occasional full technicolor flashbacks, that's a kind of hyper-remembering. Don't you ever forget what mortal danger looks like. Ever, ever, ever. It's a valid adaptation, a valid adaptation. The numbing and withdrawal cluster is a kind of resource sparing. That's very widespread in our physiology, that in an emergency situation, we have all kinds of adjustments in the body that pour resources into what we have to do to survive. If a lion is chasing a gazelle in the hope of getting lunch, both the gazelle and the lion are pumping out massive amounts of cortisol that shuts down in both of them all of the things that they don't need going on in the body, that don't contribute directly to either not being lunch or getting lunch. And this is an example of resource sparing, because when you are in a situation of other human beings trying to kill you and doing a damn good job of it, you shut down all interests, activities, relationships that do not directly contribute to surviving that situation. Then finally, the third category, the so-called hyperarousal cluster, is very simply the mobilization of the body and the mind and everything in the body to survive this very real situation. Now, there is one aspect of the hyperarousal cluster that I want to really hammer away at. And that is that, so the vigilance, the readiness for lethal action, that this is a potent destroyer of sleep. Obviously, if you're sound asleep, and it is the deepest levels of sleep that are restorative, if you're sound asleep, you cannot respond immediately and effectively to being attacked. And so a soldier's sleep is a sort of a light and not very restorative doze. And when that persists into civilian life, it raises hell. I have to tell you, I'm a complete nutcase on sleep. And I don't know how many of you here are clinicians or something like, so I would include clergy and something like. Could I see a show of hands? How many of you are active as clinicians? Well, I would like to say that, in my view, your first job and persistent job with any combat veteran who comes your way is to help them toward, in any way you know, toward more and higher quality sleep. Now, that seems, that's way too simple-minded, Dr. Shay. Can't you say something fancier, please? But to get fancy for a moment, Sleep is fuel for the frontal lobes of the brain. What happens in the frontal lobes? What do they do for us? The frontal lobes is where ethical self-restraint, emotional self-restraint, all kinds of interesting cognitive functions like being able to say, that was then, but this is now, and they're different. Wow. Now, the physiology here is blazingly clear that every hour of lost sleep, on the average, if somebody is sleeping only 4 hours a night, every hour of lost sleep drains the tank. And when you're truly out of gas in your frontal lobes, you become a moral moron. This is painful. But there is a physiology to virtue. In a room with so many clergy, I cannot restrain myself from asking you to reflect on what an unfathomable mystery it is that God created us as material beings rather than entirely spiritual beings like the angels. But we are stuck with this physical being, and the physical being is what it is, and part of that is how the frontal lobes, what the frontal lobes do for us. But the physiology is really clear that sleep is fuel for the frontal lobes. So if a veteran gets extremely sleep deprived, what happens? You get that famous explosive anger. You get the terribly destructive, impulsive sexual dalliances, or even sexual coercion in a totally inappropriate way that raises holy hell. So everyone, families, clinicians, and I want to mention employers need to be thinking about this. This is a community group, and some of you are either employers yourselves or know employers as people you can talk to. If you have somebody working for you who, whenever the supervisor or the foreman says, who is willing to do a shift of overtime, he's always the first person to say. Well, it is totally understandable that a supervisor or foreman would say to himself, boy, he has great motivation and a great attitude. What a terrific employee. And in fact, veteran employees are often the best employee that you've ever had. But what you get with a veteran employee, if he's a combat veteran, is also in your own self-interest, as well as the employees, is the obligation to not contribute to his downfall by just being oblivious to how many shifts of overtime this man has signed up for. I had a patient, an African-American man, a Vietnam veteran who was in the 101st Airborne, and it turned out that the head of the Metropolitan District Commission in Boston that operates the bridges and tunnels also was a 101st veteran. And this man went to the head of the Metropolitan District Commission, and as a result, he got a job as a toll taker on the Tobin Bridge. Now, for those of us wearing suits and with fancy degrees after our names, this doesn't sound like a plum job, but in 1970, in the African American community in Boston, that was a plum job. It had benefits, it had a retirement program, and he did shift after shift of overtime because he was always ready to do more. He made a mission out of his job, as so many veterans do if the conditions trigger that in them. And he got so sleep deprived that a motorist said something that he interpreted as disrespectful, and he popped him. And predictably, he lost his job. Fortunately, he didn't go to prison. He could have. But that man's life took a very bad turn at that moment. So I've said enough, you get the point. And now I have to reawaken this screen here. Let's hope it's not. There we go. Okay, so those are the three clumps of things, and the categories make excellent sense in terms of valid adaptations. One more thing about that, and I'm specifically addressing the clinicians, that if you really feel that in your gut, that these are valid adaptations, the veterans you work with will experience that as respect. They will experience it as respect, and that is so fundamental to this supportive relationship being a successful one. These are valid. This isn't a sickness that you got because you were a weakling or you had bad genes. It's a valid adaptation to real situation. Okay. Now, sticking with sleep, what is the least expensive medicine for sleep, most universally available, and the least hoops to jump through? Everybody knows the answer to this. Alcohol. I have no religious scruples about alcohol whatever, and in fact, I look forward to a wee bit of alcohol to come down after this performance. But I am here to tell you that the pharmacology of alcohol as a sleep medicine was designed by Satan himself. It's a disaster. Many of you already know these facts, and I won't march you through the specifics of tolerance and the specifics of the speed at which it's metabolized, which means that you might get to sleep with 2 stiff ones, but you're going to wake up way too early because it's already been metabolized and it's gone. And so I'm going to leave that, and I am an MD, and I am legally entitled in the state of Massachusetts to prescribe pills for sleep. But this is not a special pleading of a pill pusher. Every single clinical discipline, whatever it is, has a great tool bag to improve sleep. The clergy, if they present it effectively and well, perhaps introducing a veteran for the first time to a set of prayer practices are enormously effective in helping people sleep, if they're lucky about the receptiveness and so forth. But every the clinical psychologists have a terrific tool bag. The acupuncturists have a terrific tool bag. I know a Navy captain's psychiatrist who was doing acupuncture in theater in his last rotation to help people sleep. The chiropractors have a great tool bag. There isn't a single discipline, you can think of 5 others, there isn't a single clinical discipline that doesn't have a good tool bag. Use them all. Use any one the veteran is able and willing to use. Now, okay, said that. Now, so here is the primary injury that I talked about, and then the complications, like if a mortar fragment or a high-velocity bullet takes off a soldier or Marine's arm at the elbow. That is, from a surgeon's point of view, the primary wound. That primary wound isn't going to kill this service member. But the complications, and everybody in the room knows what the major complications are. I'm not talking exotic stuff. Bleeding to death, hemorrhage, and infection. The hemorrhage will kill you quick. The infection takes a bit longer. But those are complications. And so salvage surgery on the battlefield and in those evacuation aircraft coming from the battlefield and getting to Landstuhl in Germany and so forth. Salvage surgery is the tedious business of monitoring the physiology and attending to those, preventing those complications. So the main complications of PTSD, of simple, uncomplicated combat trauma, well, the complications are, we already talked about alcohol abuse, danger seeking. People get very addicted to living on the edge, the fast motorcycle driving, which the Vietnam generation did not invent. It's not a stereotype. It's a fact. Chaplains around big bases like Fort Hood have told me about a holocaust of young service members in single vehicle, often motorcycle accidents. It's a disaster. So those are the complications. Now, I'm going to beat this metaphor to death, and I'm going to introduce you to something called wound contamination. This is the other big arm of salvage surgery. If dead tissue or foreign bodies like fragments of wood or clothing are driven into that wound will never heal. It will always be infected. You must clean out the wound contamination or that patient is doomed. We hear stories about somebody who lived for 50 years after a war with a bullet in their spine or excuse me, in their spine or somewhere. Well, that bullet was quite sterile by the time it got there because it was hot. And that is obviously a foreign body. but the organic material like clothing or wood or dirt that gets driven in by an explosion is not, and it is going to be a nightmare until it's cleaned out. So moral injury, and you've heard this resonant phrase already, is my version in this setting of wound contamination. There are now currently circulating two flavors of moral injury. The first, which I introduced, and apparently I coined the term. I could find it in the handouts that I used at the Amphibious Warfare School at Quantico in 1998, used in exactly the sense I use it today in those words. I didn't use those words in Achilles in Vietnam, but the story of Achilles in the Iliad is a story of moral injury. Agamemnon betrays what's right, and he is the top dog. He's the person who has the skeptron. I think I got that word right. The scepter, the staff that gets passed from person to speak. And he has the largest contingent of soldiers and ships on the beachhead. And he is the legitimate leader. And so Agamemnon betrays what's right in a high-stakes situation. And in that culture, the situation that he betrays is the proper way to treat a man of honor. He publicly dishonors Achilles in front of the whole army. And he also violates what's right not very long before that, a couple weeks probably, probably a couple weeks before, when he disgustingly dismisses the priest of Apollo, who comes very humbly to the beachhead with a big pile of ransom for his daughter Chryseis, who has been captured in a raid in a neighboring town. And he very humbly says to Agamemnon, "Please, sir, accept this ransom for my dear daughter." And Agamemnon dismisses him with unbelievable crudity. I'm torn between my desire not to offend your ears with the actual crudity and the desire to impress upon you how horribly disgusting his behavior is to the priest of Apollo. Now, this isn't Shay in the 21st century in Michigan, United States of America. The poet allows us to hear the mutterings of the troops. Respect the priest, accept the ransom. Respect the priest, accept the ransom. And so we know that Agamemnon is, in fact, violating the normative order of his own forces. So this is really where Shay's concept of moral injury comes from. It comes right out of the Iliad. 1, 2, 3. A betrayal of what's right, intentionally stated in common language terms, no technical philosophic jargon here. Betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority, number 3, in a high-stakes situation. Now, Shay's assertion is that when all three are present, moral injury is present, period, net, no discount. And I have a further observation to make, and that is that when all three are present, the body codes this as physical attack. And it gets all churned up and aroused and mobilized as though you see a lion bounding toward you, ready for you to be lunch. Now, I don't want to make too much about that bodily reaction, but it's actually the only clinical distinguishing feature between my version and the second version that has been developed by Bill Nash, a Navy captain psychiatrist whose final job in the Navy before retirement was combat and operational stress control. I forget the last word in his title, but anyway, he was in charge of it for the Navy and Marine Corps. And him and Brett Litz at the National Center for PTSD, Shira McEwen, also at the National Center, and a number of colleagues. Eve Carlson, the current president of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, has been doing some empirical studies of moral injury that are very, very interesting and revealing. Anyhow, Nash, Lids, McEwen, and others have said that they have a concept of moral injury that is exactly the same except for the second item, moral agency. In their version, it's a betrayal of what's right, number one, but I did it. The service member himself was the moral agent in violating what's right. And it's horrible, it's hideous in war when that situation arises. And it has always arisen, I'm sure. It has been the phenomenon, that constellation, not with that term, has been addressed over decades by ethical philosophers under the heading moral luck, which I find a somewhat opaque construction, it's almost always moral bad luck. But if you look at philosophers like Bernard Williams and Martha Nussbaum, they talk about moral luck, and in my opinion, they are talking about either moral injury that I'm talking about, and you can look at the final chapter of her classic book called The Fragility of Goodness, a towering classic in ethical philosophy. Anyway, without going down that rabbit hole, these are the two flavors that are circulating, and they aren't all that different in their phenomenology. Both of them just devastate the capacity for trust, which in turn, just like destruction of sleep puts people on the icy stairway to alcohol dependence and abuse, moral injury of either flavor is a fertile ground for suicide, for criminality. It deforms good character. We are in America in general, and particularly in American psychiatry, we tend to break out in hives when somebody says that somebody who made it into adulthood with really admirable good character could be turned bad by any bad experience. We reject it. We don't like it. We don't buy it. Well, this idea has a brilliant pedigree. You can trace it very clearly from Plato through the Stoics and then jump over to Immanuel Kant, and then a great admirer of both the Stoics and Kant, Sigmund Freud, adopted it. This Platonic notion said, using Plato's words, that if you make it out of childhood with good breeding, is what Plato called it, we would say today good genes, and, he was no dummy, and good upbringing, then your good character, your virtue, your reason would form up as hard and immovable and unbreakable as rock. Now, that's a beautiful notion, that if you make it out of childhood with those two good resources, you got it made. You got your virtue, you have nothing that can shake you. It's beautiful. The trouble with it is that it's complete crap. Now, the American Psychiatric Association basically buys that. And they have systematically rejected every diagnosis brought to them that even smells like or sounds like or quacks like the statement that good character can be damaged in adulthood by bad experience. They rejected the diagnosis that is part of the ICD, International Classification of Diseases, 9, 10, 11, 12, and I'm trying to remember if we're up to 13. It's in all of them, and it's accepted, and it's called persistent personality change after catastrophic experience. And it's supported by overwhelming evidence and accepted worldwide, except in the United States, because we don't believe in that. And they rejected the diagnosis that the Boston conspiracy presented, known as complex PTSD to clinicians, or PTSD plus, which was altogether developed by Judith Herman, Mary Harvey, Bessel van der Kolk, and a whole bunch of other people in the Boston conspiracy, of which I'm a proud member. And that was rejected by the American Psychiatric Association under the beastly name disorders of extreme stress not otherwise categorized, specified, not otherwise specified, DESNOS. Ugh. So, and one of the leaders, who I will leave nameless, of the people who were involved in the field trials say it was all a problem of Occam's razor. It was Occam's razor, Occam's razor. And he seems to have forgotten Hauenstein's famous utterance, "You should not use Occam's razor to cut your own throat." Anyway, so the APA for sure breaks out in hives whenever anyone comes to them that way. And there is another one coming their way from Germany, from the Charité in Berlin and the German equivalent of the Social Security Administration, Michael, oh God, I'm blanking on his name. Senior moment here. Michael Linden, professor at the Freie Universität Berlin, has mountains of data from the post-unification period on the people whose perfectly respectable life trajectories were just shot out of the sky by reunification. We're not talking Stasi here, unemployed Stasi. We're talking unemployed fine optics makers and sanitary engineers, people who knew that they were doing something of value and did it well, and their lives were just, their legitimate expectations were just shattered in the course of reunification. And he, Michael Linden and his colleagues, sort of sadly expect the American Psychiatric Association to be influenced by good data. It's again no bad thing that happens in adulthood if you're okay before that can ruin good character. And this entity, they call it post-traumatic embitterment disorder. And those of you who've worked with a lot of really badly injured combat veterans will recognize embitterment as something that they know painfully well. So, both flavors of moral injury are prodigious promoters of suicide. I believe that the reason for that is that they both promote despair. My preferred definition of despair is when you become certain that virtue is no longer possible for yourself. That is, to me, a rock bottom cause of despair. I can never again, I have no possible hope of ever seeing myself as a good person. And moral injury of both sorts cause despair, and I think despair is a very important cause of suicide. Empirical evidence indicates that it is a big promoter of family violence. My experience in the clinic suggests it's also a big promoter of criminality, that people with moral injury are likely to gravitate toward criminal careers, especially if they have valuable skills like knowing how to blow a safe with explosives. I'll stay away from the war stories from the clinic. Some of them you can't make this stuff up. Anyway, so let me see where I am now. I think I've covered that and covered that. So we have these two flavors, and they're obviously closely related, and they don't exclude each other. One can lead to the other in any order. They can happen just in the same instant. And I invite you to consider the painful scenario. An army platoon gets into a bad scrape in Iraq or Afghanistan, and the lieutenant makes an entirely legitimate tactical judgment. We gotta get out of here. And he orders a withdrawal. And one of his soldiers says, "But Joe is wounded. We hear him out there screaming. I'm going after him." And the lieutenant says, "The hell you will, out." And it's a direct order. So if the soldier obeys, and everybody in this room knows that in all of our services, there is a deep commitment, ethical commitment, usually stated as, we don't leave nobody behind. I'm not selling grammar here, I'm selling the facts on the ground of military culture. We don't leave nobody behind. So if this soldier who obeys the order obeys it, he is likely to have at that instant both flavors of moral injury, where the lieutenant was violating the shared ethos of the ground forces, we don't leave nobody behind, by ordering this withdrawal. And this soldier, anybody who's been in a long infantry fight knows in their guts that, yes, disobedience is always an option when in that kind of situation. Because number one, the enemy is really close and the military justice system is far away at that moment, and the soldier is most likely going to lose his life trying to go bring Joe in. He's not reflexively obeying orders. He knows he has a choice to obey or disobey this order to withdraw. So he may carry with him not only the sense that the lieutenant violated what's right, but that I did it. I let Joe die. I let Joe die. As unrealistic as that formulation may be, there are men carrying that around with them. So, okay, so deterioration of character. What happens if your capacity for trust is really devastated? And that is common to both forms, the destruction of the capacity for trust. If your capacity for trust is really devastated, you enter a world of very, very limited options. When you encounter another human being, you are stuck with the settled expectation, with no trust, that they're going to harm, exploit, or humiliate you. Now, some people say, well, Doc, don't you mean paranoid? Okay, fair enough, it's paranoid, but this psychobabble doesn't add one little thing to our understanding of this human being. And I strongly encourage everyone to stay close to the phenomenon. The phenomenon is the expectation of harm, exploitation, and humiliation. Now, if that's your settled expectancy, what are your options? Well, those of you who are clinicians, and many others as well, have experienced the option, strike first. Get your blow in before this clown can land a blow on me. So that's one option. Another is to go hide. We are all aware of combat veterans living out in the boonies, trying to avoid every possible contact with other human beings. And there are some in our cities living in attics and basements, and only coming out at night because they hope and intend that they won't encounter anybody else when they come out. So strike first and hide. And then there is a third option that Odysseus embodies so brilliantly. You can become a really fluent liar and develop a whole lot of false identities. And in the course of the Odyssey, I don't have a count in my head, but I think that he has at least 3 different false identities that he puts forward in the course of the Odyssey. And there's this very, very funny scene when he's sound asleep and put on the beach in Ithaca by the Phaeacians who've given him a ride home. And they leave, and he wakes up and he doesn't recognize the landscape, and the goddess Athena appears in the guise of a young shepherd lad. And instantly Odysseus starts spinning out this load of malarkey about who he is and how he got there and where he's trying to get to. And it's a very funny scene because Athena knows exactly who he is. She's his patron goddess. And is there a feminine for patron? Anyway, never mind. So she says, Odysseus, drop it. Don't you know who I am? I know who you are. And then she's dropped her disguise, and he recognizes her immediately, and they go on from there. But anyway, so those 3 options. Now, what's missing here is cooperating with a freely cooperating partner. Partnership. That's void. That never happened. Never happened when your capacity for trust has been devastated. So this ends in a terrible mess in family life, in the workplace, in civil society. It's awful. So if these 2 flavors of moral injury are different, is this a difference that makes a difference? Well, my belief is, and I can't prove this to you with finely honed scientific studies, we just don't. I don't know, and I think nobody knows. But I'll tell you what I believe. I believe that moral injury of the sort that Nash and Lids and McEwen describe is something that may be treatable by the I don't know this is true. It may be treatable by the normal medical model, which is fundamentally the clinician and the veteran alone in a room together. I don't pretend to know, and I'm not going to go further down that line, but what I feel certain that I do know is that moral injury of the sort I'm talking about pretty much absolutely requires the input of peers. That all of the alphabet salad after my name isn't worth shit, because I don't have the credibility with somebody who has been through war. The only people who have that credibility, who have a shot at having the veteran repose trust, is other veterans, and ideally in the plural, other veterans plural. One veteran would be better than no veterans, but for 20 years I was the only psychiatrist for a small long-term milieu and group-based treatment program in the Boston VA outpatient clinic. And I didn't create that program. I had the smarts not to destroy it when 20 years before I was the new psychiatrist. The psychiatrist who'd been one of the founders of it 10 years before that died unexpectedly in her homeland of Argentina during Christmas break, and I was her replacement. And I would have had the power to destroy it, but I realized something really amazing is going on here, and I've got to learn it. And any clinicians who were interested, my mentor and colleague Jim Monroe and I wrote a detailed description of what that all looked like that appeared in the Sy and Bremner, S-I-A-I-G-H and Bremner textbook of PTSD. And I can send that in electrons if anybody would like it in electrons. So peers. I honestly believe that credentialed professionals like me can make great stagehands. We get the lights on, we sweep out the gum wrappers, we get the curtain up, we count the chairs, and then the veterans do the heavy lifting with each other. That's my settled belief. I cannot prove it to you in any sharp pencil scientific way. But that's me, I guess. Okay, so in the community, things that I know we need, I hope that the so-called Veterans Court movement prospers in American state criminal law. This is a valuable thing. Sending a veteran to state prison is sending him back to a very familiar place. It's to a war zone. Most prison tiers are war zones. And in the typical American state prison, you have to be ready to kill instantly in order to survive. And combat veterans know that stuff. I know how to do that. Is their reaction, and they do not recover. I'm getting the high sign, 5 minutes. Okay, churches. We have in this culture an incredible vacuum, gap, in terms of rituals, liturgies, narratives of purification after battle. Not every denomination is utterly devoid of any idea of what that might look like. The liturgical denominations do have some version or other of the sacrament of penance, which has a considerable capacity to do the work that we're talking about here. But it's not something that is going to be handled by 10 Hail Marys and 20 Paternosters. It has to be a meaningful penance, a meaningful process that involves a deep connection between the penitent and the clergy person. There are two forms of totally wrong response on the part of clergy, which among the veterans that I treated for 20 years, they had encountered one or the other, usually not one man, both of them. And fortunately, not always. The most common was, "You have nothing to confess, my son," and just shutting the veteran down. Just shutting the veteran. I can't hear this, is the message that the veteran gets. And that is of no use whatever to a combat veteran with moral injury. The worst one, which happened to some of them, "You did what? Get out of my church." That's fortunately, in that 20 years, I heard that rarely, but I did hear it. And so neither of those responses is of any benefit to a veteran. But a good and well thought out and highly customized sacrament of penance can go a long way, is my observation. But liturgies, narratives, music, we need that. It's a huge creative task. And I think at that point I'm done, and I will welcome your comments, questions, arguments, ideas, anything that you want to lay on me. And there are microphones here, and and there are some fine, helpful people who are going to carry a microphone to anybody who, well, here's
Test.
a gentleman who.
We can hold them for you guys, and then you can ask your question that way.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman, in his book on killing, insists on numerous occasions that combat veterans are no more likely to engage as civilians in criminal activity than any other sectors of the civilian population. Your work seems to suggest the opposite of that, and I'm wondering how you can reconcile those.
Okay. I know Dave Grossman, and I don't recall that assertion, but I'll take your word for it. I base what I am saying not on the tiny sample of veterans that I knew personally, but on the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, which for decades was the gold standard for epidemiological studies in psychiatry because of the care with which it was designed and executed. And it was self-report. It wasn't verified from court records or prison records, but self-report was that those Vietnam veterans who'd had a high level of combat exposure reported violent acts in the last month at a very high rate toward other people, and self-reported conviction of a felony. I have a terrible memory for numbers, but it's in the NVVRS that is a widely available source, and that's the basis of my assertion, certainly confirmed by my clinical experience. Dave Grossman is not a scholar, not that we're talking erudition here, but for instance, he leaves the reader with a powerful impression that killing another human being is biologically forbidden in all species. And he just doesn't have the facts right. One third of all male wolves, for instance, die by being killed by other wolves. And this is known from radio-collared, free-ranging wolves in the wild, replicated in multiple wolf populations on different continents. And it looks like, quacks like, smells like a fact that wolves kill each other under the right circumstances without the slightest compunction. But thank you for the question.
Phil Stebbins, I'm a Gulf War era veteran, Marine Corps, and I just wanted to make sure I wasn't dreaming and see if you would reiterate or possibly confirm that I did hear you correctly, that chiropractic is a viable and healthy part of a treatment plan for PTSD?
I have to practice full disclosure. My son is a very gifted chiropractor that I have enormous respect for, and I believe I said that chiropractors have a good bag of tools for improving sleep. I couldn't tell you what they can do for combat trauma. I just don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised.
Thank you.
Good evening, Dr. Shay. Great presentation. Quick question. I want to get your thoughts on technology and its impact on treating some of our veterans, in particular CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and prolonged exposure. Your thoughts on whether or not giving the veteran the ability to relive that specific moment in his or her life that caused that trauma could have a positive impact on gaining control and combating that specific moment.
The cognitive behavioral therapies are probably quite effective against narrowly defined PTSD, that is, those adaptations to the real situation of other people trying to kill you. And I don't think there's any good basis for disputing that. But if moral injury is in play, I don't think they have anything in cognitive behavioral therapy for that. Now, I'm not part of that tribe, and I don't know what they might have up their sleeve, but that is, I think that what I've said so far can be defended as true.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. If you could have a magic wand to make 2 or 3 better things happen with the VA to help in this way.
Oh my God.
I'm kind of loading the question.
I was hoping you'd ask me what 2 or 3 things to prevent psychological and moral injury in military service. I'm ready to rock and roll on that one. But
well, the reason I ask is because within this group and within this community, there's a lot of chance to go to the VA and make at least helpful suggestions and not burn them down. And
well, peers. Now, it is astonishing to me how many VA clinicians and administrators break out in hives when they think of encouraging solidarity among veterans in the VA. Sometimes they react like a mill owner who discovers that his foreman is helping organize a union. And that's how it feels to them, that somehow the VA is in a stronger position if veterans don't connect with each other, atomized. And that is denying them not only what they do anyway spontaneously, they just don't get to do it when there's anybody paying attention, because there have been, in the long history of the VA, which is a giant institution, there have been criminal gangs that have formed within VA patient populations. That's real, that's happened. And that's not the reason not to foster and encourage veterans connecting with each other. It's the reason to have people paying attention and knowing these veterans very, very well. Because that cannot go on over an extended period and not be noticed. I mean, it's if you show up and pay attention, you're going to get whiffs of bad things like people giving or selling drugs to each other or forming criminal enterprises. But that's always the worry that they have. Bad things are going to come from letting veterans connect.
I agree, that does seem counterintuitive. I have a question about the technological changes in combat. Most of what you've had to say seems to imply that combat ends up being a very personal encounter with the enemy. But there are reports of drone pilots experiencing combat trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that phenomenon.
Well, this is conjecture on my part, as you can guess. I have no personal experience with drones pilots. It would all be my conjecture. That they are human beings, and if they discover that they've accidentally killed a child in the course of a drone strike, they feel like shit. They don't like it. And that shouldn't surprise anybody, and that they would be injured by that. It is almost, you use the term PTSD here, which I think is, in the sense that I've been trying to explain it, not the correct term, but I think that would be moral injury of the sort I did it. I mean, there's a case that was in the newspaper of a drone pilot who thought he had all the bases covered, and he unleashed the missile, and at that moment a child ran out of the building that the missile was going to, seconds later, just utterly obliterate. And that poor man is going to live with it. Thank you.
Sorry, she was flagging me down.
Hello, I'm not standing up. You mentioned to me earlier about the community cleansing itself as well as cleansing the veterans. And that's part of what I think West Michigan is very good about, is taking care of their own. And I'd like to know what you would recommend. I know you don't have all the answers, but I'd like to have something I could go home with.
Purification after battle in every society that has had them traditionally, forgive me, my voice is beginning to. Always, while there may be a period of seclusion where the returning warriors are just with each other and with a shaman or whoever, there's always a time that the community is involved in the purification. We need purification after war. We sent these men and women. They went in our name and for our sake. And we can't, you you, Mr. Veteran, you need to clean yourself up, get on it. We all need purification after war.
We have time for one more question.
So it seems to me that there's something about the more recent wars that's even a bit more insidious than when, number one, you recognized who your enemy was, and secondarily, deployments they may have been long, but there were not the series of multiple deployments that our current veterans are going through and current military members. I don't know if you can speak at all to what's changed and what you're seeing with younger veterans dealing with some of those issues.
First of all, I have no personal experience with current theater veterans, or a tiny, tiny experience. I won't go into the details, they're unedifying. But I'm afraid I must be flagging because I forget the beginning of what you said that I did want to comment on.
So I was talking about the multiple deployments, and all the first part was not knowing who your enemy was.
Okay. What the multiple deployments is clearly something that needs to be addressed, but I need to tell you a little sleep story here. I knew quite well, still know quite well, a retired Marine infantry officer who, when he was a major, was known in the Marine Corps as the major with a 50-pound brain, and he was assigned to the Quadrennial Defense Review activity in the Pentagon. And that's a rabbit hole that I'm not going to go down. But anyhow, I get a phone call from him, and he said, "Jonathan, do you know what I discovered?" He knew me well and had heard me rant about sleep. I discovered that the sizing construct for operationally engaged forces in the QDR is 4 hours of sleep in 24. And there was this sound of wonderment in his voice because he had personally experienced that, deployed to the current theater where he was part of a cell, a command cell placed on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the colonel running that cell absolutely believed that 4 hours of sleep was all that anybody needed. And this is madness, absolute madness. And what needed to happen was what really needed to happen was for there never to have been a war with Iraq. But putting that aside, being in it was to make a realistic and honest assessment of how big the forces needed to be. Because we were burning through our troops at a ferocious rate, just destroying them, using them up, burning through them. And that's absolutely true of the Guard and reserves as well. And the Congress ultimately is responsible for the end strength. And before the Congress, the secretariats have to have the balls to ask the Congress or to demand that the Congress increase their end strength if they're going to have that kind of operating tempo and deployment tempo. It was insane. Sorry, I'm in a rant.
Dr. Shay, thank you very much. You live up to your reputation. And any guest of ours at the Hauenstein Center gets a Ralph Hauenstein tote bag for your fine talk. So thank you very much, sir.
Favors.
Party favors. Some wonderful things in there from a great veteran, Ralph Hauenstein, to you. And I just want to remind you that Dr. Shay has graciously agreed to sign your book, your purchase of Achilles in Vietnam, outside in the lobby. And I also shameless author, but that's okay. You deserve it. You earned it. And then also just want to remind you that tomorrow, if you want more of this, more insight from a great lineup of speakers, be here at 9 o'clock in the morning. We're going to go till about 5 o'clock and continue this great conversation that Dr. Shay has started this morning. Thank you very much. Right here in this auditorium. Thank you.